Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast about the ways attackers target mobile apps, how apps put your data at risk, and steps you can take to harden your mobile presence. I'm Mike Shima, host of Application Security Weekly. Thank you to Quokka for sponsoring this webcast. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We'll reserve some time at the end to answer your questions. Our mobile devices and the apps we use cover everything from wallets to email to messaging to social media to games to authenticators of our identity and many, many more things that have become almost indispensable to our daily lives. They're convenient and ubiquitous. Convenience is good. A lot of cybersecurity could benefit from the good UX design principles in many consumer apps. Conversely, a lot of consumer apps could benefit from more cybersecurity principles. Our goal today is to highlight 8 types of risky mobile apps and the ways we might counter them. And while the list might sound like it comes from an LLM trained on the names of Disney dwarves, the threat they pose aren't a fantasy. We've got, and as you can see on the slides here, overprivileged, harvester, colluding, shifty, sloppy, leaky, chatty, and sticky. It's quite a vivid list. Importantly, the different ways these apps target data mean they're a concern for our personal devices, BYOD environments, and even managed devices. After all, in a world where supply chain risks remain near the top of everyone's mind, allow listing apps is a great but incomplete solution. And speaking of incomplete, these are not just necessarily 8. There could be many, many more, maybe in near infinite ways that these apps can pose risk. Joining us to talk about these usual suspects are Josh, Nikos, and VJ. So we can get rid of the slides and bring in Josh Copeland, who is a cybersecurity expert with a wealth of experience in the field, currently serving as the Director of Managed Security Services at Quadrant Security. He's a 20-year veteran of the Air Force and has served in leadership roles with Bose, AT&T, and GDIT, focused on security operations, governance, and the cloud. Hello, Josh. Nikos Kortis is the CTO at Quokka, leading the company's engineering and research and development teams. Prior to that, he was research assistant professor at George Mason University and a guest researcher at NIST. Hello, Nikos.
Hello.
And Vijay Pawar has been with Quokka for over a year and currently serves as the SVP of product. He has over 20 years of experience in security and enterprise software, driving innovation and technology disruption. He brings expertise in identity and access management, unified endpoint management, and mobile security. Hello, Vijay.
Great,
well,
thanks.
We've got glad to have all 3 of you here. And as I mentioned, we've got some quite unusual suspects. But before we get into just maybe some of our favorites and what they are, I'd love to ask, maybe this is for the Quokka team to start with, maybe Nick or Vijay, where did these come from? Why are we talking about these 8 in particular?
Yeah, I can take that,
you can
so just, obviously, Nikos handles a lot of, the engineering side of things, and I'm his counterpart on the product side. On the product side, obviously what we have seen is over the years, Quokka has this contextual intelligence, and, we looked at customer data, we looked at what are the attacks out there, what are the different ways, we call it apps are becoming the new endpoints, right? Which is especially on mobile, right? The attack surface is huge. So we went and actually went through all our data, and we figured out, what you're seeing out there, which is the 8 kinds of attacks. We gave them names, right? So, for example, overprivileged applications that ask for a lot of privileges, right? So we have all these rules, and that's what we did. We categorized them together, right? One of the key things is colluding applications, where apps on their own may seem innocuous enough, but they can talk to each other and share information. I'll ask Nikos to actually, dig in further into each of these threads.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. As Vijay mentioned, we tried to categorize them as best as possible, but as it was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, it's not the case that one application might fit in only one category and this is the single threat that we pose. For example, there's a lot of applications that are colluding and harvester applications, because ultimately what they want to be doing is that they want to harvest as much information, private information from users as possible. And in order to do that, they would need to collude with other applications to have some access that it was not given to them. So back to the definitions, if we can give like a quick overview. As was mentioned, we have overprivileged applications. These are applications that are given too many privileges that they don't need, for example, access to resources that they shouldn't need for their normal workflow. And depending on if they are system level applications, I bundle with the firmware or user applications, the damage could be bigger. We have colluding applications, which basically, this is a very interesting category, one of our favorites. These could be applications that are either specifically crafted so that they can extract more information from the user's mobile device by splitting functionality into many different components that are deployed as individual apps, but they can all work together in tandem. Think about an application that has access to your contacts only, another application that has only access to your location. On isolation, that might seem like this information cannot be used to identify the user, but if these can work together, they go to a single entity, and this information can create a better profile of the user. We also have sloppy applications. This is usually the majority of apps that we see, apps that don't follow a secure software development lifecycle and don't, let's say, test the applications before they are deployed in the web store. They could have weaknesses, they could have code smells, like things like hard-coded keys and problematic behavior that, if the device is compromised, could lead to actual vulnerability and exposing the user's data. We have leaking applications. This is another category that's one of my favorites, which is basically applications that leak private information of the user, either to the system logs or over the network. Think a call log application that helps you filter spam callers, but at the same time could send this information back to a server, wherever, for doing analytics or for improving the service, which is something that you don't need. You definitely don't want your phone number connected with which people you actually text or call being stored somewhere else. We did say a couple of words about harvester applications. These are applications like very big social media apps that harvest as much information as possible for the user in order to create a profile. The risk for that is that basically the exposure is too much. We have safety applications. This is a very rare category, if I might put it this way. It used to be prevalent a while ago, and I'll give an example of this. These are applications that drastically change their behavior between versions. A fun example about this was an application back when there was a lot of piracy in the app stores, and there were a lot of applications that basically gave you access to streaming movies that are currently playing in movie theaters. At some point, this got picked up by the App Store vendors and the security auditing process that they had, and basically didn't allow these applications to be published. What the developers ended up doing is that they masked the applications as something different. So the first couple of days, the application appeared as a cooking app that had recipes. And this is a real example that's taken out from the store. And after 2 days, the interface completely changed, and you could see like a list of movies, series that you could stream. Obviously, this functionality can be uncovered by deep analysis of the app because this component is there. But that was a very interesting point. And later on, they even tried to change how they submit or try to download code from the internet and change the behavior during runtime. That's for the safety apps. We also have chat applications that can interact with SMS or with the SMS messages. They could send an SMS on behalf of the user, are the call logs. These are usually leaky apps as well, because such privileged information, if it leaks in the log, that is a problem. By default, that might not be an issue, but depending on who the vendor is and what security practices they are following, that could be a problem for the end user. And finally, we have sticky applications. As you know, applications that remain persistent in memory. As you know, a mobile device has limited resources. All the vendors are trying to do as much as they can to squeeze every last second out of the battery that you have on the device. So having an application being persistent, doing things like potentially collecting data in the background, or just not following the best security practice, not security coding practice in order to be efficient, could also be a problem for you, because at the end of the day, your phone won't last a day, basically.
Absolutely.
And that could be weaponized, but still, that's a different discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great intro to these, and we'll come back maybe some of our favorite ones. But one of the things I also wanted to point out about this list, it's a mix of apps that maybe have intention, like malicious intention behind them, and other apps that maybe just developers made mistakes or developers weren't following good security practices. So, Josh, when you see a list like this, what comes to your mind as you're trying to think of like basically defending against them, whether it's defending yourself or your organization or even just friends and family?
So ultimately it comes down to, what am I using this app for? What is the thing that I have downloaded it for, the purpose? and what permissions does it actually need? If I'm downloading a run tracker, yeah, it's probably going to need to have my location enabled so it can actually track where I'm going, how fast, and it's going to link to my watch. It's going to track my heartbeat. But does it need to have my camera permissions? Probably not. Does it need to have access to my microphone? More than likely not. But they might have it in that application already enabled because they just didn't think maybe I should turn that off. And really, it's not that actor might be, or that application might be malicious, but maybe someone can get into that application and turn it into malicious. Or to kind of one of the other points, you have colluding apps where I get a malicious app that then leverages all these other apps that have these overly permissive capabilities to pull data in. So it's really kind of just thinking about, what do I really need to do? When you look at the stats, 36% of all applications want access to your camera.
Yeah.
Now I can look at my phone or my iPad and go, 36% of these apps do not need access to my camera.
Right.
33% want to track my location. I can think of maybe 2 that I actually want to track my location. My Waze, because I'm trying to get from one place to another, and my Find My Device because I'm forgetful and leave my stuff all over the house. Other than that, do things really need that? Probably not. So it's really just figuring out, what do you want the things to do, and really get more granular and turning off the things you don't want. Unfortunately, we're in a very kind of take things out of the box and use it the way they are because it just works. And that's great, but there's a lot of side effects to that. I can't tell you on the actual hardware side of the field where I've gone into an organization and I look at the switch they have in the rack, and it's a Cisco switch that they literally pulled out of the shrink wrap, racked in, jacked stuff into, and did no configuration on it because it just worked. Now that's completely, bad security posture, but that's no different than downloading an app on your phone. I download the app, click the button, say I accept the terms, and the app does the thing I want it to do. But it also has all these other things. We're fortunate that most of the major vendors have, ways to identify where applications might be overly permissive, but it's still on us to know what we want that app to do, to either approve or deny those permissions.
Yeah, and I think knowing what we want that app to do, I think speaks to the idea of, well, what are the risks here? Because I'll make it only slightly joking, like an MDM application is kind of an overprivileged harvester app, right? Because it wants to have a good observability, what's on your phone, and it wants to collect what apps are running on your phone. Are these approved, not approved? So that's not necessarily what we want of full concern there, but we have, like I think Nikos was talking about, leaky apps. And, Josh, you're just now talking about camera apps access. Maybe it's, why does it even need camera? So maybe let me throw out to the panel, how do we understand how much risk we have from this? Because of what is being targeted, like what's the data being targeted, and ostensibly these the phones themselves have some degree of sandboxing. And so it's sort of that, just trying to navigate, how concerned should we be? So maybe that's the easy way I'm trying to ask this question. Maybe I'll throw it back over to VJ. How concerned should we be about some of these?
So, here's the idea, right? Your phone knows more about you than your significant other. Okay. People interact. It's got all your personal data. It's got all your, for productivity reasons, your corporate information, right? So at the end of the day, it's a great place for somebody, specifically a malicious app, because, like you said, OSs do have controls. There's sandboxing, right? There are other controls that you cannot, maybe, at least iOS, control other apps. Android is kind of like a Wild West, but the whole notion is, if an attacker can get to all that data on your device, they don't need to attack it from that mobile phone, but they take that data, they harvest it, as we've talked about harvester apps, and then they breach the individual's identity or corporate data on the other side, right? So those are things that are really necessary. Just recently, what was it? A couple of weeks back, there was this application which was on Google Play. In fact, that library was probably used by, I think it was a few thousand applications where they could read the MFA tokens, right? They're in. Now somebody gets access to that, they can get access to your corporate systems, right? So really, that's where it all comes down to. There's great information on these endpoints, and we got to have the right controls, right? Right controls in place, and there's a lot of user education also that goes
Part of
along with
that,
it.
yeah. How do we know which of the what type? How do we identify these apps in the first place? How do we know that we're really worried about this? Because even Nico gave that example of, here's a shifty app that might work for 3 days or so as something innocuous before it enables its its malicious or its intended behavior.
Yeah, well, sorry, to add to something that Vijay said, I would like to say that operating system, that goes to the previous question, but I would just like to highlight this. Yes, the mobile operating system has a lot of security controls in place and a different way of running the applications compared to desktop systems, but they are not without their vulnerabilities as well. So that doesn't mean that we should blindly trust the OS to always keep us safe, because things happen, and when they do, we are exposed for a short period of time until this is fixed. Depending on how much of a high value target we are, this can be catastrophic. Now, back to your question. There's not an easy way from just viewing the details on the store or seeing what the users have to say. Currently, the users, their only defense is basically seeing what the user reviews are. How many people have downloaded? Is it a frequently downloaded app? Are people happy with it? But that is not usually an indication of what the behavior of the app is doing. Some indication could be how much it annoys the user with bugging for getting access to specific permissions. We have actually seen this. For example, there is a trend between applications that are suspicious or even categorized as malicious by known vendors to always bug the users for specific permission access. If they say no, they will repeat. Regular applications usually don't do that. They ask for the permission once and they let it go. They say, if you need it, it's there in the settings. Aside from that, the only way you can actually be sure is by employing some tool to do actually mobile application software testing like what we offer. That will uncover the whole breadth of functionality in the apps through either static or dynamic analysis or a combination of both that we do.
And I think part of this too is that idea of, go ahead.
Sorry. Now, what we add to, Nikos's, statements out there are pretty much, you got to understand the behavior. We call it behavioral profiling of the application, right? Because at the end of the day, the app might have no security issues, no privacy issues, right? When you analyze it, right? Because got a malicious intent in there, right? Understanding the behavior of the app is key. And I think that was a great example, Nikos, right? Where, you have an app after a while, it asks you for permissions. It keeps asking you, keeps bugging you. At a point, you say, forget this, fine. Here are the permissions. Let me just use the app, right? So those are key elements. You need what is called in the industry is app vetting, right? Vetting any app in the App Store, which frankly is a big task, right? The millions of applications. How do you get and do it at scale and do a good job of it and not have false positives, right? So yeah, I think what it comes down to is understanding the behavior of these applications at scale.
Part of that also brings that I want to bring in that concept of BYOD and the risks here, because you've all been pointing out, here are apps that are threatening our own personal data, but often, especially in BYOD environments, we may have corporate data, perhaps in different apps. But how much, maybe starting with Josh, and we'll go through the panel, how much do you see organizations willing to or having to just rely on those the sandboxing, the protections from the phone operating system versus just saying we can't have BYOD. There's other restrictions, and what are the consequences of those different choices?
So one of the interesting things is that with the move to SaaS applications pretty much across the board for most business functions, there are a lot of things that you don't even need a app for. You're accessing it through a API interface through whatever app you want to. Um, Email is a great example where you're using M365 as your email. Unless you go in and do some very, very specific configurations on your M365, anybody on any device can access their M365 data. They can connect to it, download to their email client of choice, connect into messaging apps, and you have no real control over that unless you're forcing an MDM on personal devices and you've turned off the ability for them to use those capabilities in the app itself, and the app being the SaaS side of the house, not the endpoint app. So you really come into one of those things where even if you think you have control, you don't necessarily have as much control as you think that you do, because there are these other pieces and parts that kind of fall into that. So you have to really be cognizant of where is your data, what is your critical data, and how can these points of data be accessed? Does it matter if somebody has, the email saying I'm going to lunch? Probably not. But the email that has the invoice with our credit card numbers on it, that's a whole other story. And if I'm not able to control what endpoint applications that being connected to, that's a whole other kind of set of issues that you can't really control as much. So it's really educating folks to go use trusted apps from trusted sources. Just because it has a great review on Google Play Store or the App Store in Apple doesn't necessarily mean that it's a legitimate app. Look for those big names of folks who report to boards of directors who, if something goes very, very wrong, they have folks internal to answer to because there's a stock related issue. If I'm going to access my O365, I'm probably going to use the Microsoft Outlook app, because at least if something goes wrong, I can point to Microsoft and say, this is what's wrong, as opposed to using one of the 15 other, email productivity apps that are out there that who knows who coded them, what their permissioning is, and really if you should trust them. Doesn't matter if they have, a 5-star review and they have 100,000, comments on it. You don't really know who that is on the back end.
Part of that trust, I definitely understand the sentiment behind that, trusting, looking, trying to vet, as we mentioned before. But that seems really hard considering, we're talking about kind of 8 types of applications, but there are a million applications out there, maybe not the exact number, but, orders of magnitude more than 8 for us to try to figure out, do we trust it? How much effort should I put into trusting this? And maybe, Nikos, this goes back to what you were saying, like, how do we figure out the difference between a shifty and a sloppy app? A shifty app might be one that we don't trust, like Josh was pointing out, but a sloppy app, I think we've seen even in 2024, there's plenty of software from well-respected, well-financed, organized, organizations who have bugs, whether they're, even potentially high CVE bugs for that matter.
Yeah, that is correct. And as was mentioned by other panelists as well, it's not guaranteed that the application that has bad security, that has been coded badly, will be a malicious app. At the very least, I can tell you that the most applications that want to harvest information or want to fly under the radar, so they're not flagged, if I may put it this way, don't have any security weaknesses, make sure they abide by GDPR or whatever regulations the country has set, so that their actual true functionality won't be highlighted by something else that is unknown. Regarding the sloppy coding practices, it's not something that you can visualize while actually using the application. I mean, there could be UI glitches or problems with the app, but really, you definitely need to do program analysis at this point. Because these are, let's say, it could be things like using weak cryptographic algorithms or weak hash functions or random generation methods, which could potentially be exploited. Or there could be some payload, as Josh mentioned. They could be connecting to a remote backend, and they might not have the proper protections, like making sure that they pin the SSL certificate so that this could not be hijacked by man-in-the-middle attack. So any other not official application, if I might put it this way, not that the official apps are always perfect, but any non-official application could have these issues there. You will never notice, and unless you do some deep analysis, not just behavioral, but actual program analysis to see what's the functionality of the application, you would never know. But again, back to Josh's point, yeah, I would definitely trust the official apps more than all the other ones that are nicer, maybe are prettier, fancier, offer something extra that's better in exchange with just watching an ad or something else which I cannot even imagine, because they just let me connect to all of my cloud services using one app instead of using 3 or 4 apps for doing the same thing.
Well, maybe, and kind of part of what I was reacting to too is that idea of who is doing that review, who's doing maybe the vetting, who's figuring out the trust, whether it's the end user, whether it's a security team, whether it's the IT team, something like that. And maybe this comes to the idea of like, how are you balancing this security usability while still, handling what the app can do, or just even allowing or disallowing apps? And I'm not sure if this is something that, well, let's find out. Maybe that's just the question. How do you balance that security usability, keeping users happy versus depending on what type of device they're using, meaning it's a BYOD or it's a company provisioned device? How much does that influence this discussion? I'm sure.
I mean, sorry. You want to direct this to somebody, or what do you want me to say?
I was going to experiment with leaving it to the floor, but you jumped in, Nico. So let's hear from you.
Yeah. I have some thoughts. That's why I wanted to share that. First of all, at an enterprise level, we need to make sure that the employees are trained to identify these things, and they are also trained to make sure that they don't compromise the security of their mobile devices, meaning they do not enable other options to sideload third-party applications or whatever it is that could be weaken the security posture of the device. Other than that, obviously, assuming that the IT department has a process for vetting applications before they go into the mobile fleet, at least on the business side of things, they should vet them. They should look at how much the potential for their data being exposed, or what is their attack surface if they introduce some third-party SaaS service with whatever application in the fleet, and provide alternatives to the users so that they're not frustrated and install them anyways. Because, like we said, these are bring your own device cases, so the device is not corporate owned necessarily; it's user owned. I don't know if Vijay or Josh have any more thoughts on that matter.
Yeah, I think it depends on the deployment models, right? Like as we said in corporations, I mean, I myself came with previous background from an MDM company, right, which does mobile device management, right? And we had thousands of customers, and people, I'll use a term, necessary evil, right? But people, you do need it. You need the device management to make sure, because if you leave it to the end users, making sure, they have the right configurations and right patches, sometimes they don't do it, right? And it's all about productivity from their perspective, right? And from the enterprise side, it's security, right? So it's how do you come to that nice balance between productivity and security? And that's where, there are controls now that Apple and Google have provided also, like Android has the work profile, right? So you can kind of have the workspace out in one and the personal space out in the other. But at the end of the day, what you need is, as what we're talking about, these different kinds of applications, right, that the end users install on their devices, is getting that what we call the threat intelligence, right, which is over to an MDM, right, and letting them know without. What's also important is, employees are worried with MDM, like, do they know about this app or, a dating app or whatever? I don't want my admin to know. And they shouldn't know about that. What they should know about is the device out of compliance because of security, right? And then the user, goes and takes some remediation, right? And I think those are the best practices that we see, which is give enough information to the admin and to the end user to take the necessary action to remediate themselves.
Agreed.
Yeah, Josh, I don't know if you want to add to that, or maybe I have a different question to start off with you. Is you were mentioning like that throwing a switch into a rack and turn it on, just accepting the default. And we mentioned before about what the default might be for a running app that has the camera, but it also suspicious, like why does it have a microphone or other things that it shouldn't need? Um, a lot of that could be is have you seen ways of, or have you been able to push back or influence the actual app makers to say, make your defaults different, more secure, rather than shifting that burden onto like an MDM to reconfigure its settings, or even just the end user to have those settings?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really depends on the app maker. How much do they want to influence into that corporate market? So, you know, a dating app would be less, likely to want to increase their cybersecurity posture because a random cybersecurity guy came and said, "Hey, we noticed this weird thing where, you're sending an awful lot of data back when I go look at my data usage and, it's Facebook, Reddit, and then your app. And I use your app twice a day. So there seems to be a mismatch here." But if it's something that's more along the business side, they're going to be far more, you know, incentivized to be secure because I'm going to really tell them like it's either you fix this stuff or we're not going to use your product and we're going to, ban it from our folks being able to use it. And we've seen that, kind of across the board where it's, you know, don't use this particular app because we have these, questions and concerns about the ownership, the integrity of the application. We know that it's overly permissive and we know that's collecting all these things that, why do you really need to collect that? Um, it's interesting, almost all your social media type apps, absolutely one of the first questions they ask you is, do you want to import your contacts? And for them, it's totally a business thing. If I import the contacts, then you can create, more connections. You can invite people who don't already have it. It's all about reach for them from that perspective. But, maybe I don't want all my contacts because I have my contacts, kind of divided in my phone of, my personal versus my professional contacts. And I don't want those things kind of mixed up someplace else. Well, the social media platform is not going to care one way or the other. But if I'm talking to, a professional thing where I'm licensing it for an organization, they'll care a little bit more. So it really comes down to what's in it for the organization on the back end. Is the juice worth the squeeze for them to fix these problems, or because they have 100,000 5-star reviews, do they not really care because ultimately end users just care that it works and does the thing I want it to do, and don't care about any of the security implications of that.
Yeah, on the Quokka side, you're vetting these apps, so you're seeing these overprivileged or the sloppy or leaky ones. Have you seen app developers respond favorably to these, or are they just kind of in that, well, we've got those 5-star reviews, we're just going to continue as is with our defaults?
We have seen both, is what I'm going to say. There's certain
Okay.
cases where seriously, there are applications that have very bad reviews, and the developers are trying to defend their position. But there are applications that we have seen have issues inside, like programmatically leaking information, PII information, which is one of the worst things that I don't want to be seeing in an application, the leaky apps. They have very well reviews, nobody has seen anything, or somebody might complain about the UI, or the application wasn't working as expected because the users obviously couldn't identify that type of behavior without analysis, and the developers didn't care at all. They didn't even respond. So it's just a matter of how much exposure they want to get, and if they're in the beginning, I would say, because in the beginning they want to have favorable reviews. After a while, they might not care, but the problem is still there. It's independent of what the users will say.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It all depends on the level of exposure that vulnerability gets. Like, for example, what was it? I think 3 weeks back or a month back, we actually exposed a CVE, right, in one of the I guess it was a sloppy leaky app, maybe, or
Yeah,
just a leaky app, right?
yeah, combination.
It was, yeah. So again, the developer did go ahead and make the changes, but see, that's the level. It's what is the level of exposure that they get, and then they react on it and try to fix it. But to Josh's point, right? I mean, what motivates the app developer to do it, right? On the business side, definitely we see people reacting very favorably, right? Because everybody talks about security, brand, privacy. Um, Consumer side, depending on the level, and not so much so.
I'm curious. Let's pick on the consumer side, or maybe the end user side, because as all of you were pointing out, maybe the developers do, or maybe they don't care. In that spirit of do I care or not, some employees just want to use an app, or just some users, let me use that phrase, just want to use an app. But if we think about like security awareness training, October is coming up, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. How much have you seen employee awareness training be important and used versus being important, used, and successful in mitigating risk? Or would you choose actually something else other than employee training?
So
I don't know who wants to take that one first. Yeah, Josh, dive in.
I'll take that first. I am one of those folks that I'm of the opinion that a lot of cybersecurity awareness training is modeled to check the box for some compliance requirement that you have, whether it be a governmental, industry, something of that nature. It's click through, 20 slides, take a 5-question quiz at the end, and you're good for the year. That will never work to fix these problems. Ultimately, if you want to have good training, it has to be personalized to what matters to those individuals. They're really not going to care that a company's data is going to get leaked. That's not personal to them unless they can come back and say, well, if it gets leaked, I'm going to lose my job. But if you frame it to where your information's on here, this is what you do to protect yourself, to protect your family, then you get a little bit better buy-in because you've shifted the focus from protect me and my stuff to protect you and your stuff. And when you do that, you've now engendered actual buy-in because they care about their stuff. They care about their data. They don't want to, go out and look on the dark web and see that they cost $1. I do. I look about every 3 weeks or so. My identities cost about $1 on the dark web. And that's because I was a federal government employee. I got breached by OPM a bunch of times, Experian hack. I was an AT&T customer because I worked at AT&T. They had a big breach. My dad's all over the place. But I still take caution to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to protect myself and my family's data, even if that happens to be on a corporate device, because there's still things about me in those corporate environments. And when you make that shift and make it from, protect the company and their intellectual property to, protect you and your friends and family, that's kind of that big difference in, good training.
Is that how we feel? Is that the good approach, the good description? As Josh completed the story there?
I couldn't agree more with what Josh said, seriously, especially the personalized training part and the fact that it is just for compliance reasons. I haven't seen organizations, which I don't want to name, that ended up putting a time limit in that presentation because people literally just clicked through the whole thing. Or there were blanket questions like, what is phishing? Yeah, everybody knows what is phishing. But how do you protect yourself from phishing? A specific scenario, or different people, like Josh said, need different types of training. And that goes on to the mobile device, or who you would use a mobile device, because as it was mentioned, now a mobile device has all your personal information there. It knows even more than your significant other, we could go as far to say. It didn't used to be the same case with your desktop computer. It had only the type of information that you were comfortable having inside. You didn't carry it with you all the time. You didn't take pictures of your kids or check in places where you went. So, yeah, and there's no mobile training, by the way. In any compliance training I've seen, I haven't seen anything for the mobile part so far, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Mike, you bring up a very good point, right? Like typically, I've been through a lot of big organizations and their training, but it's typically phishing, anti-phishing, social engineering,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And things like that. But how much how much do they highlight the mobile side of things, like don't download these applications unless you know, or make sure things are right? It's not, and you're right. I think that should be highlighted, and awareness, right? Training is very important on that side of things. I'll bring out one point. Even so, by the way, Quaka, we work with federal agencies and agencies around the world. You know, there, 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 there is interest in making, let's put it this way, the citizens and consumers more aware of,
Mhm.
you know, uh, I would say not just malicious applications, but applications that can have an issue. So there is work going on. Just so you know that that amount of that information can be brought to the actual consumers and citizens.
Yeah, I think it's just this month that the FCC is starting their cyber trust mark for IoT devices. So in the spirit of that, maybe that will be coming to mobile apps in one way or the other. And shifting back from the idea of the end user and that what their responsibilities are here. Let's go back to the developers, because my wishful thinking is that this is really the responsibility of developers to fix, to address, etc. And one of the questions that come up from the audience is a good one, in the sense of bug bounty programs. You're vetting these applications. There's also random people, I say without pejorative at all, that like to look and are curious and reverse engineering, taking apart apps. I think probably bug bounties are a good thing. But I want to ask, maybe the better question is, when does a company start using a bug bounty program for their mobile apps? And I'm not sure if three of you have actually run a program or interacted with one.
I've done a bug bounty program before. Typically it's one of those things. If you're smart, you build it out early and you get it well documented and you have a process in place. Unfortunately, typically it doesn't occur until the first time you have a researcher come out and reach to you and say, hey, we have this vulnerability, but we're not going to tell you what it is unless you pay us.
Yeah.
So that in turn forces you to come up with some kind of bug bounty program, or you just risk it and say, we vet our code and we know what we're doing, and I don't think there's really a vulnerability there. So ultimately, to your point, it absolutely is on the developers to do secure, tight coding, but that's really just not the way that we've done things in the last 20 years. You can take it back to very, very early IT cybersecurity. You had to have very, very good clean code because our media formats were just infinitesimally small compared to what we have now. I can think back to my youth where we had the 8-inch floppy disk, and that had like 32 megabytes of storage on it total. Like that was it.
Yeah.
Now, I have video files that I took on my cell phone that are that big. So there's not a emphasis on having good, clean, tight coding because there aren't the limits that you had, 30, 40 years ago where, you had to make it super clean, super tight because you had limited processing, limited storage, and limited memory. Now you have, kind of virtually, for particular mobile app, almost unlimited resources. Unlimited in that there's going to be more on the device than what you're ever really going to need. So there's not an impetus to do that outside of, either personal integrity or you have that kind of security mindset, or you're an organization that's forcing you to do that.
I'm curious about that. Is that because you're mentioning the clean tight coding, which Software quality, absolutely agree there. But those constraints, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think we could find lots of, before CVEs were around, many of the Unix environments having buffer overflows, smashing the stack for fun and profit, picked on a lot of good, old 20-year-old plus code. So my question more is it that constraint, or is there something else that we could push developers towards them? Maybe isn't just actually a bug bounty program that's showing they have problems, but something else that's getting them to write that better code.
Well, and you kind of already hinted at it a little bit with, software certification from an external vendor, saying that this other party has evaluated my code and says it is good, it's clean, it's secure, it's doing all the things it's supposed to be doing. But then it goes back to motivation. That's going to cost money. It's why everyone's not a FedRAMP environment, because it's going to cost you a couple $1 million to become a FedRAMP environment. Yes, that is what everyone theoretically wants to have for their level of security, but there's a cost to benefit ratio. Am I willing to spend all that money to do that? And am I going to get a return on that? Getting FedRAMP, sure. You might be able to get a return on, because it opens the aperture of who you can sell to. Getting a shiny badge saying that you have, good code that is, as bug-free as one can reasonably expect. How much does that give me actual ROI back to my bottom line? And when you can quantify that into real dollars and cents, that's when you'll see better movement and having folks who do better, cleaner code.
Is part of that too, maybe for the Quokka side as well, because you're doing the vetting, obviously identifying these 8 types of apps. It's an easy taxonomy for us to talk about. But what are some of the skills that you'd recommend organizations try to hire for, try to have, if they're trying to have security teams help with those mobile development? Is it just, reverse engineering tools? Is it code scanning tools, threat modeling? I could list off a lot of options, but I'm curious if you've seen or would recommend something that feels more impactful, more useful, successful here.
Yeah, the way we, our customers do it, right? I mean, there are different kinds of, obviously, application security testing tools, right? You got all the way from web to API. And on our side, it's really what we're talking about today is the mobile apps, right? So it starts with actually doing, using the right tools, let's put it that way, that does static analysis, dynamic analysis, interactive analysis, right? Also, what is really important is it's a layered defense, right? So one is you analyze, right, and then you remediate. The next is there are other technologies or products out there called RASPs, right, which provide application shielding, right? So it's again, analyze, fix, shield your applications, and then test again before you push it out to these app stores, right? And those are the best practices. And in some cases, there's also penetration testing, right? So which is done not as often, but because you want to automate it. If you're coming up with this CI, continuous integration, continuous delivery of applications, you probably have releases every week. You're not going to do a penetration test every week, but you need to do a bunch of this app vetting and app testing continuously.
At the major releases, at least, yeah.
And Nikos, on your side, as you see, is there a particular tool set or skills that you look for in, anything from Frida, or Ghidra for that matter, other types of engineering tools, or what kind of suggestions might you have for orgs trying to do this?
Aside from the tools, because this is not something that just can be solved by a tool, unless we're talking about a third party that has their own tools. They actually review the security of the application by doing all those types of analysis that Vijay mentioned. The first thing is basically make sure that you know what it is that you're including in your code, because there's a very big appetite. And this goes back to Josh's point. Back when we Back when resources were limited, we didn't have internet, we didn't have all these, we didn't have Stack Overflow, all these huge libraries, third-party libraries that we could include. In order to develop some feature, we had to actually develop it. We had to put some thought into it and know the specifics and utilize it. Now we're at an era where we have mobile devices, we have managed these frameworks. Everything is handled by the system, is abstracted nicely in a way that you only need a few lines of code to make it work. And even in that case, we still could use some third-party library that even abstracts more and makes our life easier. And this could be a way to have supply chain attacks, basically, as we have seen. Now, I would say that make sure that the employees are trained to enforce a secure coding development lifecycle. And of course, that you have the tools in place by third-party service, depending on your exposure and how big of a company you are, or what are the compliance requirements you need to meet. You need to actually have some tools. Just having a tool there, I don't want to name any tool like you mentioned, because it will give you like only a small sense of, not security, it will only cover a small part of the potential weakness or vulnerabilities that your application could have.
You introduced, I kind of alluded to or mentioned supply chain at the very beginning. You brought it up here again. And clearly that's a way that even of our trusted apps could suddenly become untrusted because of a supply chain problem. That's a vetting part. So one of the, I want to take a moment to ask, tell our audience, if you do have some questions, start populating those and I'll keep an eye on there. But one question I want to, as we start to wind down here, though, is what about the emerging trends in mobile app threats? We've got this list of 8. For each of you, maybe we'll go Josh, Vijay, Nikos. Is one of these 8 the one that you would really emphasize that is maybe more equal than others to pull out our Animal Farm, or is there a number 9 that you would throw onto this list?
I'll go first, and for me, I think it's just leaky code. That's my number 1, just because there are so many ways that it can happen, and it's rarely intentional that it's happening. It's just one of those things that it's there and it's kind of prolific across the board. So for me, leaky code is kind of my number 1.
On my side, really, it's the app collusions, right? Because those are so hard to find out unless, like we talked about, understanding the behavioral profiling, because you get an app and it looks good, and you get another app, it looks good. You don't have visibility into, you actually need to see how apps talk to each other on a device, right? Like one of the things we point out is you may analyze an app on its own, but that's in a vacuum, and on a device, apps are all together on a device, right? And how do they interact with each other? Those combinations are really the ones that can actually, exfiltrate your data. So for me, I think I could call it ingenious, but those are the ingenious applications that collude with each other.
Definitely some fun creativity there. I have to agree with that. Nikos, what about you? One of these 8, or is there a number 9 lurking out there?
No, there's no number 9, and I don't have anything to say because currently for me it's also leaky colluding apps. I have to say one thing though. I used to worry about over-privileged apps until I started, basically periodically reviewing what permissions I gave the apps that I'm using and removing them. So that is not such a huge concern for me now. And I used to also worry a lot about harvester applications, because I don't want people harvesting my information. I don't want to give my data away for free, or give it away to begin with, not just for free. But it turns out that most of these applications are from either social media type of networks or similar types of situations that I convinced myself that I don't need to use on my phone. I can just use it via a private window in a browser. So I kind of stopped worrying about that category personally. I'm not saying that people shouldn't worry, but seriously, if I had to pick between colluding and leaky applications, I would probably also pick colluding applications, because these are, like Vijay said, they're so hard to find. You won't know unless you have them on your own device. And the more apps you install, the higher the probability of this happening on your device. And this is basically what's happening now. If you look at your device, you probably have like more than 100 apps that are forgotten there. You installed at some point, you used once, you periodically use, and they're still there.
Yeah, and it's funny you say, just don't use the app or avoid the app, because that's a bit of a callback to Josh's comment about how many of these apps can also just be a web application. They can just be a web app instead of installing it on your phone. So, I guess avoidance is one of the takeaways. Just don't do it, to invert the Nike slogan. Um, going back through the panel, is there something that you wish that also, or a recommendation for our audience, or something that you wish like either maybe iOS or Android did that would be better for protection? What's that takeaway in sort of that defending yourself, or putting more responsibility onto maybe the OS or the app developers to defend their users? And start at the end again. Maybe Josh, if you want to start us off on that.
Yeah, so I think the big thing is just create a system that incentivizes doing the right thing when it comes to developing code. Whether that is a legal framework, whether that is a, obligation where you can do, a, class action lawsuit against an application developer who has, had their application leaked out, or even just incentivizing them in ways of saying, if you do get these, levels of certifications, the app store of your choosing will prioritize you in the list of applications, or give you, some kind of shiny badge that says this is good, please use this. So it's really just driving how developers value security. The more you can drive developers to value security and not just produce code that works, is what's going to get us better faster.
That's going to jump in real quick, because that motivator, that psychological motivation, I think answers or helps reflects one of the questions that came up here about how organizations should develop their SDLC in response to these threats. And I think giving that appreciation, doing that awareness, sounds like that's one of those approaches. If we continue this discussion though, VJ, what's that? How do we shift the responsibility to help our users? Is it on the iOS or the OS? Is it on developers? And what's the one thing you wish that they would do differently?
Yeah. And, I think this is piggybacking off what Josh said, right? It's either a carrot or a stick approach, right? So, and finally, at the end of the day, at least on the mobile side, the apps go in the app stores, right? So how can you incentivize the developers? You take the stick approach and say, well, there are 3 levels of certification. You are at L1. You want to get up to L3. You got to go through these and fix these things and get it up there, right? Because as an app developer, typically they are like feature. I'll pull in libraries from somewhere. Now I'll use ChatGPT or some LLM and throw in some stuff and get it out there, right? Fast. I think that is the element, right? Or you incentivize them with, better promotions and things like that. But it all has to be in that place where everybody goes to download these apps, which is the app stores.
Makes sense. And thank you for getting AI in there. We haven't mentioned that at all as one of those apps that people just love to play with, right? So, Nikos, you want to take us out? Well, you get the final word here. What's the takeaway that you would put out there for our audience?
Well, I would say always question twice why an application asks for certain type of functionality. Don't trust an app if it looks nice, because most applications will just ask for your data and get it, because they have put some effort into making them look appealing. They have a nice website behind it. They could even have fake reviews, who knows about that. So always question if you need that many apps, if you need them all, if you need to give them all this type of access. Don't play with security settings on your device to make things easier so that you can get some other app, some other game that you cannot find in another store. Always install applications from the official stores, because at least they have been vetted by a human to whatever extent. Basically use common sense, I would say. And keep in mind that security is a way of life. It's not something you do at one point in time. You need to continuously keep on doing that, which is basically what Josh said. Has been trying to say throughout this entire webinar.
Yeah. And yeah, it's absolutely that. Yeah, there's not one point where the vetting is done and carry on and you can forget all the rest. So, and as you pointed out, always questioning. I want to say thank you to each of you, Josh, VJ, Nikos, for allowing me to ask questions twice and maybe even more than twice throughout this panel. You've all given some great insightful answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks for having me.
I want to say thanks once again to Quokka for sponsoring this webcast. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and to everyone from the future, perhaps, who's listening to this as a recording. There is a resources tab if you'd like to find out some more about mobile security. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you once again and go install some secure mobile apps and keep your device secure. Thanks, everyone.